we are reading a letter by a man called John, who tries to put into words a set of experiences he has of Jesus of Nazareth, a teacher who lived and died, and his followers claim was raised from the dead about 60 years before this letter was written down in the first century, near the end. It's an ancient letter written to groups of Jesus followers struggling to live out this movement in the shadow of the Roman Empire. John describes a set of experiences, pictures, visions. So far he's seen the living Jesus. He's heard that Jesus speak messages of comfort but also of challenge to these groups of Jesus followers, starting to be called churches. Messages about how Jesus is somehow standing in their midst. John's seen a door open into what he calls heaven, and by that he seems to mean where God is at work, not somewhere far away, not somewhere in the future, but sort of behind the scenes, a reality that presses in on our reality and we can somehow sometimes sense in ways beyond our normal way of perceiving things. He sees a throne and he gets really excited because there's someone on the throne who's overwhelming and who's active on the throne. A real power, the living God, not the fake claims of the empire and the emperor. He's seen in this throne room, in this space, all of creation represented by 4 living creatures and then 24 elders responding to the one on the throne by singing songs of gratitude. We would call it worship, because this God has done something overwhelming, and not through some mighty empire military project, but through his own death and suffering. John's seen a book, a scroll, and it seems to represent God's plan for how he's now going to put his project back on track. He has dealt with everything that gets in the way, and now he's going to put his project back together. And so John has seen at the centre of this a lamb who looks like it has been slaughtered. An obvious image for Jesus of Nazareth, whose life and death and resurrection somehow has dealt with everything that gets in the way, and he's the one who's worthy to open the seals on this scroll as the project moves forward because of what he has done. And so now, in chapter 6, John sees the Lamb open the seals on the scroll. And the first thing John sees are some horse riders. I'm not sure what you think of horses. I've been careful with my children and taught them from an early age that horses are poisonous. What I really mean is that horses are really expensive, but it comes out as poisonous. I'm actually not really sure about horses. One of my most vivid tragic or traumatic memories as a child was being forced to watch something called the Horse of the Year show and being terrified as these horses seem to be forced to carry people around and jump over all these different obstacles, and often smashing their shins into the top bars and knocking them over. I was terrified, and it's upset me ever since. You might think horses are powerful, beautiful. You might think it would be a great hobby. You might think that they're good for transport, that they're good for working in the fields, they belong on a farm. All good, but in the first century, horses represented only one thing: war. Horses were the equivalent of tanks in that era, and John's vision of horses and riders means only one thing to his listeners: war. I'll stop here for a second and say that at this point you're probably thinking or expecting a group of celebrity characters known as the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, in capital letters, to appear. Now, the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse are famous from posters, movies, books, films, stories, songs, heavy metal album covers, and tattoo designs. One of the most recent versions of the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse is in a brilliant and clever and a funny book, and then actually a more recent box set series called Good Omens, written by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman. Both Gaiman and Pratchett are actually some of my favourite authors. Absolutely love this particular story, and the series with David Tennant and Michael Sheen was particularly good. Here's a wee bit from the description. As any good apocalypse story should, the four horsemen appear, except this time they arrive on motorcycles. As heaven and hell start gearing up for the end of the world, part of the path to war includes calling on the four horsemen, the traditional heralds of the apocalypse. Historically, they've been war, famine, pestilence, and death, but by the time Good Omens takes place, pestilence has retired in the age of penicillin, and pollution has taken its place. The key word in there is, I think, traditional. The traditional heralds. In stories, in art, in myth, in legend, on tattoo designs, and in box sets, there exists this tradition, this set of images and ideas about something called the apocalypse with a capital A, which also means the end of the world as we know it, all in capitals. This tradition is that there's an ongoing war between two sides, heaven and hell, again with capital letters, and a secret timetable of events about how the world will end, the end of the world as we know it. And it's all set out in a neat plan, a secret plan, in this book called Revelation. And kickstarting that part is the four horsemen of the apocalypse. These traditions, these symbols, are fun. They're fascinating. They make for great ammunition for stories, for posters, for movies, for songs, for box sets. However, all of that is not what we're actually finding here as we read this ancient letter. Remember, John has said himself, this is not a book of secrets. The whole point of what he's saying and what he's doing and what he's trying to describe is to uncover something, to expose reality and truth. Let's note that in his vision, John has seen a door open into what he calls heaven, describing where God is at work. And in his vision, things are happening now. When John sees that in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, a victory has already happened, what he's getting at is that the project that's moving forward is not something away in the future that might happen. It is something that is active now. This is about a restoration, a recreation, a renewal project that God is working on now. Maybe it's helpful to remember that the word apocalypse, maybe without the capital letter, simply means unveiling, uncovering, pulling back the curtain. Let's beware of capital letters. Let's beware of traditions. Let's love stories. Let's love books. Let's love box sets and art, but let's realize what we are actually dealing with here and wrestle with it. So what does John see? The first horseman is on a white horse with a bow and a crown. All these are symbols, like I've said, of war. But more than that here, it's not just war, but it's a lust for more and more war, for conquest, a conqueror bent on conquest. This first rider is about that never-ending lust, a lust that requires to be fed for expansion and continual expansion, and a whole machine that needs to be fed. More and more resources. Remind you of anything? It certainly would for John's listeners. The next horseman is on a red horse and given a sword, and this rider is allowed to take peace from the earth. The words peace and the word sword are really significant in here. Jesus' followers, listening in the shadow under the boot of the Roman Empire, would have reminded, stamped on their images in their minds daily, that the empire deserved gratitude and worship and money, especially because the empire had achieved and kept peace by the sword. So what's being talked about here is internal conflict, is civil war, the way that in empires humans end up turning on each other. Time and time again, the story of empire isn't just that they get taken over by other empires, but that they crumble and self-destruct within them because of humanity's tendency, temptation to turn on itself. The third rider is on a black horse and carries measuring scales. These measuring scales were symbolic of rationing out of food in the marketplace, especially in times of war. A loud voice here is saying 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine. 2 pounds of wheat would feed a man for a day, but that costs a whole day's wages, which means a man in this situation can only feed himself wheat for one day and can't feed his family. So therefore he would have to choose the inferior grain and get 6 pounds of it that he could eke out to feed his family. But meanwhile, the price of luxury, if you like, goods like oil and wine, they're protected. Sound familiar? As the empire machine needs fed, as the lust for conquest demands more and more, the rich get richer and the poor still get poorer. Budget cuts are necessary, we're told, to protect the economy, the markets, the machine, the empire. If money needs to be spent on defence, it can't be spent on daily bread. This is supposed to be an ancient letter, remember, but it's depressingly, achingly familiar, don't you think? The fourth horse is pale. The word is actually for a yellow, green, sickly colour. This is a sickly horse. Named Death is mentioned, and Hades. Death and Hades tend to come together as an image. Hades just simply meant where people went when they are dead, under the ground. A huge proportion of creation is here affected by war, not just by the deaths in the war and the civil wars and the internal conflicts, but also of famine and plague. And like we heard in the Good Omens box set, plague is replaced by pollution. David Attenborough and others might certainly agree. As much as humanity has made great progress in dealing through technology and expansion with food shortages and with diseases, at the same time humanity's methods of expansion have also led to huge pollution and an incredible damage to the creation. I think that we've read enough of this letter together to know that John's vision, his experience here, is not about 4 actual horse riders. It's not even about 4 sets of events that are coming sometime in the future. What's being uncovered, unveiled, exposed is a reality of the human condition, of what happens when humanity works against its creator. When the creation plan is ignored or corrupted or even rejected and actively worked against. These are the consequences. This vision doesn't seem like a prediction to me, or a set of clues, or some signs to look out for. It seems like a disturbing actual mirror, or a set of mirrors that reflect back in lots of different ways from different angles and expose what is really going on, despite what the empire might try and tell us, in every age. And sometimes before putting things back together, you need to expose the extent of the problem. The story of creation, the story of the Jewish people, the story of God and his people from the very first poems and songs at the beginning has been a story where God creates potential. But not just the potential to flourish, which is what he wants, but the potential for his creation to go its own way, to reject him and work against this project. And that in these stories, God allows the consequences of that to play out because he doesn't want to give up. That he wants to give his creation the chance to turn around. These 4 riders and their coloured horses would give echoes to John's listeners of stories of hope in the middle of these dark times in Zechariah, in Daniel, in Ezekiel. Would represent realities that John's listeners face now in the Roman Empire, but also were true in the Persian Empire, in the Babylonian Empire, and when the people were in slavery to Pharaoh under Moses, and even when the empire, the Jewish people, had their own empire under David and Solomon and built it on slaves and military power and did the same to other people. The truth, the harsh truth of the lust for conquest, of internal conflicts, of economic inequality, of scarcity, of rationing, of famine, of death. These are the realities that humanity faces in every age and under many different empires. And the reality is one that John's listeners faced, has been repeated throughout history, and is a reality we recognise today. I don't believe John is writing down this experience to help me try and predict some sort of heaven and hell war game that might start at any moment and I need to look out for. These are words of comfort in the face of struggle and crying out, how long? These are words of hope and security to a group of people calling out, how long will this last? These are words that expose the extent of the problem, but these are also words of hope. There is more going on. God knows. God is at work. God has dealt with everything that gets in the way. God is with us. God wants us to join in, to hold on, because this is not the end of the story. This is not the end of the story.